So one of my favourite episodes of The X-Files stars former professional wrestler and Governor of Minnesota, Jesse Ventura. And he plays a man in black who, through the recollection of a UFO experiencer in the scene, tries to dissuade the experiencer from talking about his UFO experience. Your scientists have yet to discover how neural networks create self-consciousness, let alone how the human brain processes two-dimensional retinal images into the three-dimensional phenomenon known as perception. Yet somehow you brazenly declare that seeing is believing. He goes on to suggest that the experiencer actually saw the planet Venus. This view of the origin of consciousness arising from computational complexity in the brain is widely held in science today. However, since this episode first aired, which was the mid-1990s, our knowledge of cognitive processes in the brain has advanced significantly, but scientists are now closer to figuring out just how a complex of non-conscious units come together to form consciousness. It's known that the temporal lobe indicated by Persinger as being the source of both near-death experiences and the UFO abduction experience, among others, is involved in a variety of processes that we associate with intelligence, and this includes recognition, perception, understanding language, learning and memory. Perception here, though, really means the processing of vision and auditory processes and smells. So it's really processing of sensory inputs. It's not perception, it's an awareness. And what I've described here, these are not qualities of consciousness that I've described here. These are cognitive functions that can after all be operate subconsciously. So with the advancement of scientific knowledge, these cognitive processes are beginning to be well understood, but how the processes gave rise to consciousness is not understood. It remains a mystery. So some researchers in the field of consciousness studies are actually beginning to make progress by changing focus from this idea of the origins of consciousness, reframing their approach to ask the more fundamental question: did life give rise to consciousness? And in the view of this new wave of academic research in consciousness that looks beyond the basic mechanics and beyond the functional aspects of it, there's a growing realization that decades from now, Western science will cease standing alone from the older philosophical views of the nature of consciousness. In the words of author Adrian Nelson, just as mass and charge are fundamental properties making up the observed world, might awareness in some unrefined proto-form be similarly fundamental. Among thinkers in academia today, there is a growing sense that we have anthropomorphized consciousness and that its origins lie not in us but in a deeper aspect of the world. There's a feeling also that however consciousness becomes manifest, that the components of the brain that give rise to it are in reality rather more like receivers than creators of consciousness. But what do we really mean by consciousness? How do we define it? Consciousness implies awareness, and it's been described as the subjective experience of both internal and external phenomenal worlds. It's the key to understanding, to meaning, and to the expression of free will. And there are three general possibilities considered in science for the origin and location of consciousness. One is, as already mentioned, the idea that consciousness is the product of evolutionary biology. However, the mechanisms by which the brain produces consciousness out of essentially the brain's ability for computation alone remains a mystery. But regardless of this, the evolutionary adaptation of brains and nervous systems are seen as being all that's required still in science for consciousness to have arisen. This is the view widely held by neuroscience, psychology, and most Western philosophies, but also the field of artificial intelligence, where consciousness emerged from the evolution of complex computation among simple neurons, which each receive what they call integrated synaptic inputs, basically firing like we do in computing. They actually mimic that. The standard model of computer simulations of brain function in the field of artificial intelligence sees the brain as a network of 10 times 10 to the 11, which is 1 with 11 zeros on the end, integrate and fire neurons basically operating like a computer. The assumption is that this network, from this network, consciousness, meaning awareness, perception and feeling, will somehow become manifest. In the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, HAL, which is cinema's iconic AI computer, tirelessly watches the activities of the astronauts aboard the Discovery. Those long silences in the movie give the sense that HAL has some light of awareness. But can AI computers actually be conscious? Are they capable of awareness, feeling, free will, or are they simply non-conscious cognitive processes? Does a computer care that it's beating you at chess? In consciousness studies, it's these non-conscious processes that include mental processes actually, and processes that include control of behavior. And these are like the zombie modes or the autopilot, if you like. And these are driven by cognitive functions, but they're not themselves conscious. These in consciousness studies, these are the easy problems to address, as they're called. And there's the hard problem, as it's been called, is quite literally how these cognitive processes come together to be either create or become accompanied by this subjective feeling that you are experiencing here and now looking at me. So far, the brain as a computer view has failed to address these and other problems, and one such problem is explaining how a single-celled organism, such as this paramecium, can swim, find food, avoid predators, learn, remember, and find a mate, all without synaptic computation. On the surface of this paramecium are hair-like cylindrical polymers called cilia. You can just about see that. I don't know if you can see that clearly. See, these little hairs called cilia are made up of doublets of what they call microtubules, and they act as both a sensor and a motor, enabling the organism to swim and move. And microtubules are also found throughout human beings, but also, as far as but also neurons in the brain. Standard model of brain function is that consciousness arises through 100 billion cells called neurons, transmitting electrochemical signals to each other. Within each neuron, there are hundreds of these microtubules. Making up one microtubule are millions of proteins called tubulin, arranged in a complex molecular lattice. In the theoretical model proposed by Dr. Stuart Hameroff and Sir Roger Penrose, who's a mathematician from Oxford University, every nanosecond, tubulin proteins flex and bend into two shapes, one being open, one being closed. And this is driven by quantum mechanical processes, and it can thus act as a quantum computer. The protein can be either open or closed, or in a superposition of state, meaning that both open and closed at the same time. And now this is known as the it's quite a complex thing. So the idea of having something open and closed at the same time. It's the Schrodinger's cat analogy is that you don't until you open the box, you don't know whether the cat's dead or alive. So the same scenario is occurring here, where these microtubules are either in a closed state or an open state, and the fact that we don't know what state they're in means they're in both at the same time. And probably jumping a bit ahead of here, the idea that it becomes known that we know what state that is in is simple, basic creation of consciousness. That's knowing. So within a single neuron of the microtubule, activity equals about 1,000 trillion in computer power, and they argue that consciousness arises from these countless computations amplifying what they call the latent field of consciousness awareness embedded in the fabric of space-time itself. In the conventional views, the experiential qualities of conscious awareness are assumed to have emerged from complex neuronal computation at some point in evolution, whether recently in human brains or at some earlier but unspecified level of development. In these views, consciousness is an emergent property of a complex computational activity. On the other hand, Orch OR, which is orchestrated objective reduction, which is a theory by Penrose and Hameroff, follows that the notion that objective reduction events with primitive experiential qualities have been occurring in the universe all along, in the reduction of the quantum superposition to classical reality. So the superposition of state is broken and becomes, in that case, the tubulin becomes in closed or open state. And then what they're saying is this is a primitive knowingness. So in summary, this orchestrated OR activity is taken to result in moments of consciousness, awareness, and or choice. So Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff go on to consider that even in the primordial soup postulated to have given rise to the chemicals of life, certain simple chemistries would have been capable of producing this effect. The hexagonal shape of the cross-section of the tubulin molecule here, which that's the hexagon, is not far removed from what the benzene ring shape, which is these are carbon atoms, bonded, six carbon atoms bonded in a ring with hydrogen bonded to the one carbon, and that leaves an unbonded electron. So essentially what you have is a single bond, single bond, and double bond. But really what happens is the electrons just delocalize and form a delocalized electron cloud. Probably skipping along to story short because this is kind of complex. It's the not knowingness of this state of this cloud, not knowing what the electron is the quantum superposition state. Once you identify the point of the state or the chemistry interacts with it, that you collapse the wave function, and that is the process of awareness. Aliphatic molecules, such as the ones I'm showing here, is basically those that have what they call a polar end and a non-polar end. The polar being soluble in water, non-polar being non-soluble. And what happens when you put these things? You get these in detergents. This is what happens in detergents. The soluble end will and then non-soluble parts all stick together, and this eventually forms something called a micelle. Where inside the micelle you have the non-polar parts, which is what I've shown you with the benzene ring structures, and then the outside is the put the grouping of things together. It gives it greater solubility because when they're all stuck together, so you can essentially dissolve more of these in water, for example. And this is the basis of bioproteins, like even RNA and DNA have the same structure really, but in there through the central core of a DNA strand, for example. You have the non-polar, and the outside is the polar to make it soluble. So yeah, if the premise put forward by Hameroff and Penrose is true, then the collapse of the wave function in this primordial supercomponent chemistry itself could be considered to have moments of conscious and awareness and or choice. And this is the idea that proto-consciousness, proto-consciousness being expressed outside of biology in precursors to what will become biology, or what was to become biology. Now, the quantum state of these benzene ring structures, cutting a long story short in chemistry, is as I mentioned, the ring of delocalized electron, which is an electron cloud. And it's been known for over a century that chemicals that we use as analgesics all have these similar chemical structures. And it's interesting to note that no matter whether you're a fruit fly or an elephant, it takes the same concentration of these chemicals to knock out consciousness. And it's considered that it's actually the knocking out of the interactions of these the quantum states, breaking down these quantum states that knocks out consciousness. And it's thought that these benzene ring structures get in the way of the quantum processes and the microtubules, basically. So analogous to this delocalized electron cloud in the benzene ring structure are the free electron clouds in metals, where quantum electrons behave, where in metals where quantum electrons behave as a gas. The cloud of quantum electrons, as they're called, are also known as quantum plasmas. Now, quantum plasmas are found in the electron. If you know about semiconductors, quantum plasmas are found in the holiness of a semiconductor. They're also considered, that's a very small scale, and at a very large scale, they're considered to exist in the core of giant planets and in neutron stars. But as we've seen with proto-UFO plasmas in Hestel and Valin and many more, my question is simple: are these proto-UFO plasmas that, let's be clear here, show and exhibit signs of intelligence? Are they the physical composition? Do they have a physical composition capable of consciousness? Do they have awareness? Through the Penrose and Hameroff model, this would require that the plasmas themselves attain a quantum system with enough isolation from the environment to allow wave function collapse over extended periods, meaning the position of a particle could be not known for a certain period of time. So like the two outcomes of the double slit experiment, if you're familiar with that, where the observer can find either a wave or a particle, or the Schrodinger's cat one, as I've mentioned before, it's this knowingness that is knowing the outcome of this superpositional state that is the light of awareness, the origin of consciousness. Now, this is speculation, but I used to think that these plasmas would need to be coherent and isolated internal structure of complexity, with isolated quantum event effects akin to what we have in our own brains in order to achieve consciousness like we have. However, I now realise that according to Penrose and Hameroff's model, that perhaps the complexity isn't even required. Perhaps the intelligence of these proto-UFO plasmas is more rudimentary, as the article in the 14 Times put it. So with massive UFO objects or light forms seen, for example, in the case I mentioned with the Devereux family near Bentham in Lancashire, and also the Berwyn incident, if you're familiar with that one, in Landrillo in Wales, I used to wonder whether these massive objects were capable of more complex complexity of structure than we would have in that would manifest to a greater intelligence than we have in the human brain. Not that any size is any kind of measure of intelligence this way. The processes of obviously how a plasma would achieve consciousness would be very different from probably what we see in biology. But the way it would have the similarity would be where you have the point where the point is reached, where you have the isolated quantum of collapse to occur that gives rise to consciousness. So my questions don't seem to fit too well with what I know about my friends in the UFO community, really. And if you think that's weird, the next one it's even less well. We've seen the capacity for an Earthlight, a proto-UFO, to maintain a physical presence predominantly as luminous plasma. We've also seen that they are also associated with metallic balls and metallic objects. Now remember, Foo Fighters were reported as luminous balls of varying colours and sometimes of metallic appearances. Now let's look at what constitutes something as being metallic in observed appearance. Could plasmas account for a metallic form? If you've ever looked closely at a graphite pencil, you'll see that a slightly metallic sheen on graphite, and graphite's an allotrope of carbon. And where carbon normally bonds to four other atoms, in graphite it bonds to 3 other carbons actually, and it forms a planar lattice, flat lattices. You get flat sheets of graphite, and this is why they slide over each other really well. That's how it leaves graphite marks on the page. That's why I use it as a pencil. But it's also helped by the fact that the fourth electron that's not bonded forms a delocalized electron cloud above and below the lattice. So between the lattices you have these electron clouds again. And it's this free electron cloud that gives graphite its metallic appearance. And likewise in metals, it's the free electron cloud, the sea of electrons, but at the surface of the metal that gives the shiny metallic look to it that we call metallic. Now plasmas are also capable of this exposed outer layer of free electrons and can give the appearance of metal, just like metals themselves and other non-metallic materials. However, you could argue that graphite is technically a metallic form of carbon. So the implication here is that when these plasmas are visible to the human eye, they will appear as light forms, and when they're luminous. But if light production stops, or you lose the glare, like maybe you look at the same ball of light in daylight, for example, and the contrast changes. Perhaps these nocturnal lights in daylight would be visible in a metallic form, depending on the environmental conditions. Of course, this in itself does not explain away all metallic-looking UFOs as metallic clouds of ionized gas. And after all, even if you look at the Hessdalen data, as we've seen that these plasmas do actually seem to precipitate at least metal particles. And this is not limited to the Hessdalen studies. There's many studies within UFO report studies where you're probably aware of these yourselves, where flying saucers have been known to drop pieces of metal. The Murray Island was one of them, and there's a really interesting case in France as well. I think it was in one of Vallee's books. So here lies the possibility that a natural metal construct is behind the sources, but this too is just speculative. So this idea of consciousness arising outside of biology is not new, and it's not without precedent in the broader views of the UFO community either. Dr. Stephen Greer, for example, speaks of the conscious identity of the Earth and the planets and the Sun and even of the galaxy. He sees these large-scale objects as accessing cosmic consciousness as we do, and that we share our conscious awareness through non-local consciousness of singularity. This is the non-local awareness that Penrose and Hameroff refer to as the choice influenced by, dryly, they describe it as the choice influenced by Platonic values embedded in space-time geometry. But remember, the rule of methodological naturalism states that the purpose of remember the purpose of the rule of methodological naturalism, if I can say it right, which basically says that you take away any scope of intelligence, you think of things as natural phenomena. So these ideas that earth-born plasmas can also harness consciousness themselves is not far removed from this idea at all. If both Greer and Penrose are correct, wouldn't we expect earth-born plasmas to have innate consciousness? Within UFO experience testimony as well, there's also evidence that points to Earthlights being a source of extraterrestrial influence on the Earth too. The Australian experiencer and researcher Suzanne Hansen, for example, from her communication with aliens, reports to us that, well, from what she was told by the ETs, was that their mode of transport within the Earth is using ley lines and earth lights. This is not only compatible with the premise that I've shown you here tonight, it's also broadly consistent with the idea that other intelligences would use the physical phenomena available to them. We do it all the time.